The whole virtual CIO, regardless of what it's labeled, I think the original intent was is a strategic advisor. Don Penland, I'm with a private equity firm called Knox Capital.
I ended up being the guy that would get scowled at in the conference room. So a client leaves and you're having like a leadership meeting about it. Most of the time, what I would end up hearing was all projection on the outside of our four walls, right? Like, what are we doing or not doing inside our four walls?
Continuous improvement. If you're being stagnant, you're not growing. Learn about it and try to adjust to it. I built my career on working with Microsoft. When we were coaching sales folks at my last MSP, I had someone say, "Why are you paying for lunches with Microsoft people? The vendor should be paying." No, I treat Microsoft like a customer.
That was one of the earliest lessons that a mentor gave me. It was like the tech will break. You don't have to screw it up. But if you screw it up, it's how you show up and how you respond that is so important. Does pineapple belong on pizza?
I've spent most of my life in Chicago. I'm going to give the Chicago answer, and it does not belong on pizza, nor does ketchup belong on a hot dog.
Don, welcome to the MSP Insider. Please tell the audience who you are, what you do, and why the hell that you do it.
Great question. Thanks, Jeff. And appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. So again, Don Penland, I'm with a private equity firm called Knox Capital. I've been in the IT consulting and MSP space for almost 25 years now. Most of that's been across to what I would call mid-market MSPs. And, had worked with private equity on both of those MSPs, done some successful exits there, and kind of decided about 6 months ago that I wanted to entertain looking at the other side of the table, given that experience, and be able to go out and help other MSPs grow, both organically and inorganically through M&A activity.
Awesome. So right off the bat, we're telling the audience with a big old flag, and we're planting it in the ground that like we've let the enemy in the house, right? That's how the industry looks at most of the PE stuff, which I'm sure we'll get into later in the conversation.
I do make the joke sometimes that if you can't beat them, join them, right?
Yeah, right.
And then try to break the mold, right, and do it better.
Yeah, man. Yeah, that part resonates for sure. To not break the mold of how the show rolls, we'll start with the question that was left behind by the previous guest, and then we're going to dive straight into the good stuff.
Okay.
Not to insinuate that the question wasn't good for you, but either way, you didn't get any preparation for it. The question for you comes from Sean Friedman, and his question was, does pineapple belong on pizza?
Oh, well, given that I've spent most of my life in Chicago, I'm going to give the Chicago answer, and it does not belong on pizza, nor does ketchup belong on a hot dog. So.
Yeah, that's the truth, right? What is it? Neon relish and celery seeds?
Celery seeds, sport peppers. Yeah, that's a true Chicago dog. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. All right, that's a fair answer. It doesn't agree with Sean, because I didn't read the second half of his question, which was less of a question than a statement, but yes was the only right answer.
Well, I'll buy Sean a pizza and have it delivered to his house then.
Right. Yeah, Chicago pizza. He probably won't even know what to do with that extra layer of crust, would be my guess. He's up in Canada too, so
definitely going to ship him something then. So.
Awesome. All right. So today we're going to really, hopefully, the goal is to cut through a lot of the noise, not only like on the outside of the industry, but like the way that it comes all the way down into the MSP life. And that's where I felt like we could really tap into your firsthand experience. One of the things that I really love about a saying that David Powell has, and he reminds me of it whenever I chat with him, but he talks about, everyone can have an opinion, but like it's the informed opinion that counts or should matter. And so I was really looking forward to tapping into more of your informed opinion about MSP, yes, PE, yes, but like the intertwining of all of those things, and specifically through the lens of like, I'm an MSP owner, I'm sitting in the seat giving away my time to listen to this episode. Like, how can we really untap and cut through the perceptions that exist and like get down into more of the reality that exists, so that MSPs can choose their own fate. I think that's part of the challenge that most have, is like they didn't get into their business with a clear understanding of how they were going to exit either. They just kind of like fell into it and happened to end up creating a company. So we're going to wander through a couple of topics that I know are near and dear to your heart, and then we'll spend some time specifically talking about the influence that outside money has had inside our world as MSPs too. Sound good?
Yeah, sounds great.
Sweet. So I'm really glad that the first topic you had was ultimately about like client feedback failures, right? And the reason I loved this was out of two of the five MSPs that I worked at, we put an abundance of emphasis on the client experience that we delivered rather than, maybe looking at ourselves more like a tech company and paying a little more attention to the stack than we should and all those things. So, as you had mentioned, MSPs often lack a formal client feedback method, right? Like a CSAT or NPS or really anything, like any formal function there. Are most MSPs just terrified of what they might hear from their clients if they ask them appropriately?
Yeah, I don't know that I would use the word terrified, but I think they probably believe they're providing really great service.
Mm-hmm.
And without that feedback loop, you really don't know, right? And I think what they find oftentimes, what ends up driving more formality around that, from what I've seen, is, when you start seeing too much churn, right? And we all know that there's going to be some churn, and some churn can be good, right? In some ways, if it's a lower profitability client, or, those types of things. But, I think, when we start seeing a pattern of too much churn, at that point, it's sometimes it's too late, right? And
Yeah.
then you realize that, hey, I didn't have that feedback loop. So then they start implementing it. So I think, if anyone's not got a formal process around it today, that's certainly something I think that they should, right?
Yeah.
And there's lots of different ways you can do that, right? There's, as you mentioned, Net Promoter Score, NPS. There can be more customized CSAT program.
Mm-hmm.
And, I would also say that you want to make sure that you're thinking about it. If part of your house is professional services, which, can then drag through, some MSP services, that, first project, or that is equally as important as, having a regular feedback loop for the managed services,
Mm-hmm.
because that's the first experience, outside of sales or pre-sales, that, the client might be having with you. So, you really have to look at it holistically across the entire business. So I don't, to kind of go back to the question, I don't think folks are terrified. I think there's a little bit of, hey, I'm just in the day-to-day motions. We're opening closing tickets as quickly as possible, and we maybe have metrics around that, but really
Yeah.
getting that feedback loop. And then as maybe, you continue to grow, there's other ways you can get that feedback too. Maybe you have a client advisory board, right? Where then you're getting that feedback, and that
Yeah.
becomes very valuable, because that can start driving product decisions or directions for the business. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
It does. Yeah. One of the things that I found often, and I think it was probably at every one of the MSPs that I worked for, and I ended up being the guy that would get scowled at in the conference room, like after a client did leave. Like, let's go back to the churn piece. So a
Yeah.
client leaves and you're having like a leadership meeting about it, right? And most of the time what I would end up hearing was all projection on the outside of our four walls, right? Like,
Mm.
well, the point of contact was XYZ, or their business is going through whatever. Like, but it always ended up being about the client and the client's fault, or the client's ownership in why they chose to leave. And this is where I would get my scowls, is like that all may be true. And even if it is true, like, what are we doing or not doing inside our four walls to contribute to the decision that they came to, right? Like, we have to emotionally detach from the fact that they made the decision to leave, and we really need to understand systematically, how are we impacting that, and how are we like intentionally doing the things necessary to prevent someone from getting to the point where they make that decision, which is a really unpopular way of looking at that topic, because it was just easier to abdicate responsibility, I guess, right, and just place that blame on the outside. And so, one, I'm curious if maybe you'd seen some of that theme as well in your experience across MSP, and then I have a follow-up question about kind of the leading indicators versus lagging indicators.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, call it the blame game, right? To try
Mm-hmm.
to divert, right, or deflect. I think absolutely have seen that. I think that's a natural human reaction sometimes, right? But like
Yeah.
anything, some self reflection. We've all
Mm-hmm.
had to do that, right? And we're all
Yeah.
trying to look to improve on those areas. But it's the same thing, right? It's that continuous improvement.
Right.
And I think that's a key point, right? If you're getting
Mm-hmm.
that feedback, that's okay, right? Like,
Right.
that then educates you, and then you can say, okay, what are the things that we can improve upon? And I think, any MSP, just like we are as people, right? It's continuous improvement. How do we continue to learn? I think Tim mentioned that in your podcast recently, right?
Mhm.
If you're being stagnant, you're not growing, right?
Right.
So being able to truly look at that feedback and look at
Mhm.
that feedback as a blessing almost, right? To be able
Yeah.
to have heard it and learn about it and try to adjust to it. And to your point, absolutely try to find it out before there's a problem and there's a churn of that, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, because it's really about, I think oftentimes, I don't even know necessarily if it's like best practices fault or if it's just sort of like the corporate Kool-Aid fault or if there's even any fault to blame. But it seems like our industry is more interested in the output metrics, right? Like the outcome metrics
yeah,
rather than the leading indicators and the input metrics that can produce the outcome that you actually want.
yeah,
And specifically, even in today's world where AI is so accessible, people, as an example, I don't think most MSPs are thinking about ultimately at like what at the core, at the heart of NPS or customer satisfaction or any of that, outside of even having like a decent smile back or something installed,
yeah,
right? Like, and yet what's available to us today is like we could actually throw all that stuff out the window and actually track sentiment across every interaction using certain AI tools to really get to like the access of figuring out, well, do I just have like an individual at a really good company, or do I have a really bad client overall as a result of the way things are? And then more importantly, like why and where and how can you unpack and figure that out based off of the word choice that's being used in day-to-day interactions with every team member, rather than, well, we just had the QBR with them 3 weeks ago and they said everything was fine. Why did we just get the
yeah.
SEP notice now? Curious if you have any insight into or are seeing anything kind of developing more on that forefront where we can move from things as a lagging indicator, which would be like a survey result, sort of like after everything's been done, more towards the like sentiment analysis, in the real time, more on the front end of the support experience that then dictates, oh man, maybe we should go out and meet with Don because it looks like, the CFO just changed at the company or something like that.
Yeah, it's funny that you asked that question, and we can honestly say we did not prep up for this particular question. 5 or 6 years ago, we had our data team
Okay.
at the last MSP I was at, and we started looking at. We actually had an intern that came in, and we said, "Hey, we want to start looking at sentiment via email,
Mm,
right? So,
okay.
let's look at the emails coming in and see if we can pick up on certain,
Mhm.
patterns or language." To try to do exactly what you just mentioned, get kind of a leading indicator. And we started doing it, right? Unfortunately,
Mhm.
we kind of put that happened right before COVID as well. So we kind of put that to the side
Mm,
and try to figure out how to survive through
yeah.
COVID. But to your point, years later now, I think there's lots of other tools that we can use, certainly from, AI tools. We think about some of these AI tools as first kind of like recording sales
Mhm.
calls so we can coach salespeople, right? And be able to
Right.
provide them feedback. But, there's hidden gems within that data,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
You can come up with, what are we not hearing as people that we can
Mhm.
pick up on patterns because we're now, aggregating all this data across multiple client calls. One, you
Mhm.
can help, say, hey, what products am I not developing, or what sales pitches am I not doing because, we're missing it with the human ear, but now we're seeing a pattern of it within this data. I think
Mhm.
MSPs, and I've certainly have seen some folks do this successfully where they're starting to do that to look for those leading indicators just within day-to-day operational delivery conversations as well. I don't know that
Yeah.
anyone's completely like conquered it yet, but I think a lot
Yeah.
of people are thinking about it and
Right.
saying, hey, how do we implement that as an additional tool to the
Mhm.
feedback loop, right? So yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's something that there's a lot of opportunity for, and needs to be operationalized within a lot of MSPs.
Yeah. So now let's look at the flip side of that. If you had to call out the biggest delusion that MSPs have or that MSPs tell themselves about maybe why they don't need formal feedback, what do you think it would be?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I hate to use this word, but I think ego, right? They
Mm,
just kind of believe things are going well, and
yeah.
they're doing the best that they can, and their team's doing
Yeah.
the best they can, which they likely are. But
Mhm.
like I said earlier, I think there's always that opportunity to improve and learn and grow, right?
Yeah. I do agree there. Something that's interesting. I've never thought about this until you just answered that way. We as MSPs are inherently problem solvers, right? And
Yeah.
we're traditionally, how can I help type people. I wonder what it is about, or where the difference is then, right? And like not wanting to see the data, or maybe not wanting to collect it, not wanting, like the avoidance of a potential truth rather than seeing it as just another problem to solve, which is what
Yeah.
we're naturally inclined to do too. But maybe the answer is in your response as well, is that ego. Right now, we're talking the human side of it, the uncomfortable side of it, whether that's insecurity or it's fear or it's ego or it's pride or whatever.
Well, I think
I've
it might
never.
be, not to interrupt, I think it might just be culturally, right? Like,
Mm,
depending upon the culture you build, like, I agree with you. I think both of us have technical backgrounds. Like, we started
yeah.
more on the technical side, actually doing engineering, and then, kind of moved into biz dev and
Hmm.
sales and then, executive level. But
Yeah.
yeah, inherently, we want to solve the problem, right? We want to kind of fix whatever the issue is. So, as long as that's built into the culture of that feedback, that it's positive. Because I
Yeah.
think, ego, yeah, ego is driven by a lot of different things, right? Insecurity, fear, right?
Yep.
And those types of things. So sometimes, ego might not be the right word, because it might just be of an insecurity. I don't want to show that there was a problem, right? For whatever
Yeah.
that, underlying human element of that is. So, not necessarily wanting to track that or metric it, right? So now
Hmm.
we're getting really deep in the psychology, human
Yeah.
side of it, right? But
Right.
for
It's so
whatever the
true.
reason is, I think it's what is the culture that allows that to be,
Hmm.
welcomed, right? Or
Right.
used, as I said earlier, as a gift, right? As a blessing to be able to kind of hear that feedback
Hmm.
and improve the business, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah, that was the part that, to your point, having started on the tech side and then moving to the sales side, the thing that I ended up bringing to like my sales approach was still the logical and the analytical component of understanding like how to reverse engineer something, but then
yeah,
looking at everything I did on the sales side through that lens while understanding the psychology and the people and the art of it, right? So I was like marrying the art and the science together. And where I found like, and what I found was while most MSPs feared those feedback systems, right? I needed to connect those feedback systems to ultimately how I was going to go to market, which takes me to the other topic that you had, which was really that fundamentally MSPs have broken go to market strategies if they have a go to market strategy at all, right? And that it's kind of two components because it's such a big initiative, and like most MSPs want it, if not all MSPs want to grow, but they don't necessarily know how. They might have tried the
yeah,
things the industry's told them to do, and in the end what it feels like, at least collectively, is like that the MSP industry is a bunch of accidental businesses with no real strategy as it relates to growth. And I'm curious what you found to be true specific to, let's just anchor into maybe like the real go to market language, right? Because that's a wide enough bucket that encompasses so many of the pieces. But
yeah.
um, where did that unlock come for you? Like when did you see it, lean into it, and like how did you ultimately establish that successfully for growth?
Yeah, I think, look, I liked your quote of, kind of accidentally, kind of falling into an MSP. I think a lot of them, they were pissed off at the last place they were at, right? And
Yeah.
kind of started their MSP. So I think there certainly was some strategy behind, making the move,
Hmm.
when you see a lot of these that get started. But yeah, I think on the go to market side, typically what we see is, depending upon the size of the MSP, is the owner founder, right, is the number one salesperson.
Hmm.
And, to your point, they maybe when they started the business, they had a certain amount of clients that maybe followed them, right, and that became the base, that became the anchor.
Yeah.
And then, from there, they had to kind of make a decision, right?
Yeah.
Are we running a lifestyle company, right, or are we trying to, run a
Hmm.
growth business? And then what are those investments that you start to make? And, I'll correct something I said just a second ago. It it kind of does depend on the size of the MSP. You'll typically see the owner founder being the number one salesperson, but
Sure.
that challenge of owners or partners, like some of the larger MSPs I was a part of, we had multiple partners, right? We're an
Yeah.
LLC, and those partners were typically the ones who drove a fair amount of the business development, either through
Mhm.
relationships with, AWS or with Microsoft or, other channel and even
Right.
client,
Hmm.
relationships they had. Same problem though, right? Like
Yeah.
if your owners or your partners are working in the business and, holding on to those
Hmm.
relationships, how do you grow, right? How do you grow a sales team, from that
Yeah.
perspective? So,
Hmm.
it doesn't matter whether you're a single owner or multiple partnership owner when you're trying to look at, how do we now start investing in go to market strategies, both marketing and, sales talent, right? To kind of
Hmm.
be able to grow and scale that business. And that, look, I wish I had a secret sauce on that. We certainly have different battle scars related
Yeah.
to that. And, that there's a big human element that comes along with that, right?
Hmm.
And, finding the right folks and talent to go with you on that journey. But a lot of folks have solved that in different ways.
Yeah.
So there's solutions out there. We've solved it in different ways, right? But it's
Hmm.
typically, any of the businesses that we're looking at, it's the core area that we want to help grow and invest in, right?
Right. Yeah.
Because it's typically the area that hasn't been given quite as much attention.
Hmm.
Because again, you have a scenario where, problem solvers, right? A lot of the
Yep.
times the delivery generally, even though we just had that discussion on customer sat,
Yeah.
delivery generally is in good shape, right? The engineering technical background, making sure, we're providing good service there. But, that's only going to grow the business so much, right? I
Yeah.
think, you
Hmm.
and Keith kind of talked about this in one of your last episodes where you have to, invest in that go to market strategy and decide what that's going to look like in order to grow the business and get you through those different plateaus, right? Because
Yeah.
I think
Right.
that's really where people get stuck, right? They'll hit,
Hmm.
5 million in revenue or hit 10 million in revenue. And then they're like, okay, I don't know how to now get it to 15 or 20 million in revenue.
Yeah.
And there's all
Right.
kinds of strategies to do that, but go to market has to be one of those.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a couple of things that I heard you say inside that. And the main word that I wanted to stop on and like really preach and like lean back into was the relationships piece.
Mm,
Because it, in a lot of ways, it didn't matter if I was at the smallest MSP or the largest one that I was a part of. And just for reference, it'd be like 6 employees or 130 employees.
sure.
So but this thing was pretty much still true. Like relationships mattered more than anything else. It didn't matter if it was the one-to-one stuff, it was the chamber stuff, it was the associations stuff,
Yeah.
or it was in a more mature model where we really had a go-to-market motion. And then it was like the partnerships that we had in place. So what do we mean by partnerships? Well, it's like the vendors and the vendors of the vendors, and then
Yeah.
the relationships inside those, right? So a clearer example of that, like there was one of the MSPs where we really leaned hard and heavy into Microsoft. Now this would have been about 15 years ago. So like Microsoft was different then, right? But at the same time, so were the relationships, and so is how they handled those partnerships. But what mattered was the relationship that we created with our regional rep, and
Mm,
then that relationship is what always opened the doors. Whether it was the extra MDF, whether it was the leads that would funnel to us, like it didn't really matter because we had built such a good relationship with that individual that we were always top of mind or first to like first right of refusal almost, just
yeah.
because of that relationship. A different MSP in a different timeline, this would have been when Arctic Wolf was really just kind of coming out, right? Maybe 100 employees or something. And at that time, at least, the offering was unique to the market, and it had a nice way of selling through, right, at MSP. And so, like, building those relationships again created a very reciprocal scenario where it was like they were lead feeders more than anything else, right? Because they were sell through. And so but none of that would have been true if we wouldn't have stopped long enough to think about the people part, the psychology of it, and like truly leaning into and establishing just a meaningful human to human relationship. And then from that, which I think is ultimately your point about go to market, like it is the relationship and the partnerships that you build that is the unlock in the growth that you can get out of even having them as part of your plan or process or whatever label you put on it.
Yeah, no, I think that's really true. I built my career on working with Microsoft, right,
Mm.
and relationships, and first it's was funny when we were coaching sales folks at my last MSP, 11 years ago, to your point. They didn't have the Microsoft relationship, so we were trying to teach them how to work with Microsoft. And they were kind of a traditional bar when I first joined. So it was like, I'll never forget this. I had someone say, why are you paying for lunches with Microsoft people that you're going out to lunch with? The vendor should be paying. The bar should be, the vendor should be paying. And I'm like, no, I treat Microsoft like a customer, like a client, right? And more importantly, the relationship, right? Like a lot of these people are my friends, right? So, that took a little bit of time for folks to kind of think through that. And then, you have to stay at it, right? But, when we talk about a go-to-market strategy, it isn't always like go hire 5 BDMs, right? Like it's all inclusive, to your point of looking at the channel, those vendor relationships. I would bucket Microsoft in a strategic alliance type, versus other vendor relationships, and building those relationships. I remember, I had a purple badge for a long time. I was a virtual TSP, and my job was to go sell Microsoft software. And then if we were, did a good job, then there was probably some integration work and then hopefully some managed services work to kind of follow that. But our first job was to go out there and, be Microsoft, right? Help, sell the software, the solution, really, I should say, right? And then, we kind of picked up then any of that implementation work, and that came through those relationships and, building upon what made them successful, right? From that perspective. And then we were thought of as secondary. And that's a different mind shift for some people. Now, I think the Microsoft model has changed over the last few years, but, generally speaking, it still works. There's lots of great people out there that help folks with how to work with Microsoft. We help our businesses work with Microsoft, right? And those types of things. But everything kind of starts first at relationships. From that perspective. And you're going to make mistakes, right? Like everyone does. And, it's how you show up when that mistake happens that, generally solidifies the relationship even more, right?
Yeah. No, that's such a powerful point. I learned that so early on because of all the mistakes I was making, because I didn't go to school for this. It was all like on the job training and learning while I was figuring it out, right? So like my career is built out of recovering from the mistakes that I made. And that was one of the earliest lessons that a mentor gave me. It was like, you're going to, and that's fine. So will the tech. Like the tech will break. You don't have to screw it up. It'll screw up on its own. But if you screw it up, like it's how you show up and how you respond that is so important. And it does seem like that that element of the craft, if we can call it that, has sort of slid a bit to the back in more recent years, right? I think some of the craftsmanship around the service that we provide as MSPs has been diluted or watered down, whether that's because we increased some technology or COVID happened and people forgot how to talk to each other or any of those kinds of things, right? Like it seemed like we've evolved as an industry to try to be more and more about the shiniest new object in our stack rather than the outcome that we deliver to you as a business owner by partnering with us as a business owner to provide service to you. And that is a bit of the essence that I remember, 20 years ago that was instilled in me about like, you're in the business of problems. So things aren't always going to be sunshine and rainbows. So how can you show up in such a way that you can be the best part of their day anyway? And, that was just a gift to get from my mentors early on. And I would challenge
the same. I think I might have a little bit different perspective on that. I definitely hear what you're saying. I think some of it has led also, I think, if you think about like, I think you and I are somewhat similar in age. I'm probably a little bit older than you, but, we were doing like Exchange, right? Exchange, Active Directory, those types of things. You were going in and building a relation with a client, and you had to be the expert on how am I going to set up, the rate, right, to get the most highest IOs, right, for to make sure you're going to do that.
Yep.
Who cares about that now? Now we're talking about the business, right? Like, are you even talking about Exchange at that point, right? Like you're trying to figure out how are you communicating with your customers, employees, right? Geographically, people working from home, whatever, right? No one cares about, what disk, RAID is being used, right? Microsoft's just kind of taking care of that for you. So I think maybe a little bit of what got lost there is, it's we've had to shift and be more solutions
Mhm.
focused, more business focused, right?
Yeah. Right.
Again, I hate to keep kind of pointing, but I've obviously watched almost all your podcasts. The
Sure.
whole virtual CIO
Mhm.
conversation that you had, right, was
Yeah.
very interesting because, you know, regardless of what it's labeled, I think the original intent was is a strategic advisor, right?
Right.
And how can we understand the business,
Mhm.
right, and be able to provide solutions to the business. So I think some of that's required that shifted change. And I
Yeah.
think some folks just don't know how to have that business conversation, right? And I think,
Yeah.
what's made you good from transitioning from technical to sales, or myself, or a lot of folks I've worked with in the past have seen them do the same thing. They've been able to make that conversion to understanding the business. I originally got into consulting in MSPs because I was fascinated by all the different ways that companies make money, right?
Mm.
Like, if you
Yeah.
really take a step back and think about every client you've ever worked with, almost all of them, even though they might be in the same vertical or something, there's
Mhm.
fascinating ways that they create revenue, right? And they're
Yeah.
solving problems for clients. Well, that was always intriguing to me. So I always
Mhm.
dug into those things even when I was a deep tech head, right? Because I was just always fascinated by all the different ways that companies make revenue, right? Or make
Yeah.
money or provide a solution. So I
Right.
think that's where, you had a great mentor. I had great mentors, right? Very lucky in that sensation of,
Mhm.
we have to continue to kind of give that forward, right? And be
Right.
able to, train the younger generation of, how to have that business conversation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Mhm. I agree there, and I can remember that whole transition to your point about whether it was managing or migrating Exchange from this to that, but it was still all on prem. And like to your point, like you had to sit down and really engineer and architect
Yeah.
what the
There's
rate
a
was going
whole
to be and
complicated
like the speed
spreadsheet
of
for
the
that
grade.
thing.
Yeah,
I have to go
exactly.
see if I can find the spreadsheet. I'm sure I have it in in
Yeah,
an archive somewhere. But
right.
Microsoft released some really funky spreadsheets to figure all that out.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly. And like you really had to have strange conversations to get to the data that you needed to punch in,
True.
right? Like,
Yeah,
and at the end of the day, like you had to do all that, and then you had to deal with the actual people part of the migration. Like, okay,
that's
here's the
right.
behavioral
Yeah,
change. Here's what's going to
right.
happen. But I think we were so much closer to the solutions at that time,
That's
and like
right.
the back end and like the depth of the iceberg, if you will, where we were more equipped to handle the soft skills piece of like, well, here's what's going to happen. And yes, people's connection's going to drop for 20 seconds. It's going to say that Outlook's offline. And then I'm going to reboot the services and we're going to pivot over, right? And I'm going to cut over the
Yeah,
DNS and like you'll turn it back on and your email will be there, right? And
yeah,
ideally, we won't end up doing any export or import PSD crap because I've already taken care of that on the back end
right.
or whatever. Uh, but
And
to
hopefully
Pat,
you didn't run out of log space
yeah.
and everything's
Oh,
shut down, right?
God.
Because you haven't had
Yeah.
backups and you were watching backups.
Oh my God. Yeah. Hey, no one's getting any email. Oh, yeah, that's right. The mail store's dismounted. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. That's because, to your point, backups weren't there. The
Thank
logs weren't
goodness we don't have
truncated.
to worry
But
about that stuff anymore, right? I remember
wow.
getting, I know you talk about the 3 a.m. calls, right?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
literally was a 3 a.m. call I got years ago as a law firm's,
Hmm.
server was down, drove downtown, started looking at it. They hadn't done backups in like 2 weeks, right? So the log file was full. It's
Yeah.
like, come on,
Right. Yeah. Wow. That is a trip down memory lane
it
for
is,
so
right?
much of
It
what we used
hurts.
to deal with.
Yeah.
It does hurt.
It
Yeah.
still hurts. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it hurts and it hurts so bad. That's a good transition into the other topic that you wanted to talk about, which was again, I think an industry problem. Maybe not so much the MSP's fault specifically, but the topic I want to talk about now is the MSP's addiction to revenue versus
Mm,
profitability, and how do they get there? How do they even distinguish the difference? Because again, from working in peer groups and facilitating some even and working with hundreds honestly, uh, it seemed as though one, like they truly don't ever know their real numbers or their numbers at all, let alone their real numbers if you dive into it. And then like so many of them just kind of operate underneath that uh, dollars in, dollars out, cash flow management month to month. And like if I ended up with some left over after everyone got paid, then we're doing okay. And if I add a client here or there, but like there's so much more to building a memorable business, memorable, a valuable asset really, but like the staying power in it, right? And like
yeah.
the different levers that you can pull to actually be profitable versus just growing at the top line. So the question in there is with so many MSP owners well, if my thesis is true, that so many MSP owners are addicted to revenue numbers that look good, but that actually destroys the business, like overall. Maybe that's a little harsh for the language, but like it doesn't leave you with much at the end.
Yeah, look, I think there's a couple of things there, right? And this is, multi-layered chess, right? When you're thinking
Yeah.
about some of these things, and the company goes through phases of it, right? But I think some of the things we see is first, not every client is a good client, right?
Yeah.
But that definition really doesn't come in until you're a much more mature business, right? Because when you first started the business, you're
Mm-hmm.
taking everything you can, right? And
Right.
you're going to kind of shake, you're going to make deals, right? Shake and bake, right? You're going to make deals.
Mm-hmm.
And typically profitability is not, the first mission, right? When
Yeah.
you're starting the MSP or
Mm-hmm.
even maybe in the first couple of years, right? So I think, again, we have to recognize the different growth stages or plateaus that the businesses are
It's true.
going through. And then I think, thinking through, those clients that, are really driving down price, right? But
Mm-hmm.
then typically, I think you've probably seen this, I know I have, is they're high maintenance though, right?
Yeah.
So they're just sucking tons of resources from you from other clients that maybe are more reasonable, right? When you're doing those deals with them and that type
Mm-hmm.
of stuff. So I think there's multiple layers to it that come with the different plateaus or, come with, the growth of the business. But generally speaking, at some point, the mind shift has to change, right? And
Yep.
you have to start thinking, for every dollar, right, that's coming in, what's my cost associated to that?
Mm-hmm.
And this is going to go back to something I said earlier too. What's the purpose of the business or what you're trying to do with the business? If it's a lifestyle business, then
Yeah.
profitability you can manage to your cash flow, right, and things
Mm-hmm.
coming in and out, and kind of going from there. Or you're growing the business to be able to have some leverage, maybe because you want to do some M&A, whether that's with PE
Yeah.
or without PE or any other model. If you're going to go get debt, right, you're
Right.
going to need to show a certain amount of net income, right, or EBITDA,
Mm-hmm.
and be able to get a leverage on that, right, to
Yeah.
be able to go do some of those other growth models. So I think it's just something that folks have to kind of think through and mature, and I think most MSPs do and are getting there. I think some of the great peer groups that are out there. I think that's an area that gets talked about a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think certainly over the last 10 years, we're seeing more folks talk about these things and say, hey, this is where I'm trying to go. I've still got some work to do there, but they start focusing on that area more.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think? Like, what, yeah, I think's probably the right word. What do you think is the most profitable thing that an MSP could do, but almost none of them are willing to try? Right? Because I think maybe to give context to that question too, for the MSP owner that's sitting out there, realizing maybe for the first time or just having the light bulb turn on because they are a part of one of those peer groups and they're staring at these numbers that they've never had to deal with before and they're just starting to maybe get the feedback loop for the first time.
Yeah.
you know Another propensity that I saw within MSP owners was like we were really good at willing to pay for advice that we were not willing to take. Right. So I'm trying to get to the heart of that is like what's the number one lever that an MSP can pull on that would affect their profitability, but almost none of them are willing to try initially.
Yeah, I don't want to say that they're not willing to try, but they're scared. I would say they're scared of it.
Mm.
Is raising your prices because they feel like
Yeah.
they're going to lose clients, right? I
Right.
think, look, this will be an area where people get frustrated with private equity, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
it'll be one of the first things that that we talk through, right, in
Yeah.
a lot of scenarios. And they're just so used to trying not to create churn, right? Like we just talked about all this work to be done in the CSAT and growing the go to market strategy and bringing new clients in. Now you
Yeah.
want me to raise prices and potentially lose clients, right?
Yeah.
So
Right.
I think it's a very fair reaction, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think and I've seen it outside of MSPs too, right? Some
Yeah.
of our portfolio companies, when we talk through, hey, how do we grow revenue with existing clients, and they
Mm-hmm.
haven't raised prices in 3, 4, 5 years, but yet they've continued to provide new value, right?
Yeah.
One for software, right? Like you're
Yeah.
creating all these new elements within your SaaS, but yet you're not increasing your pricing, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think the confidence that you're bringing value, right, and the confidence that you have those relationships, to tie this back to some of the other things we had, tying it
Yeah.
into your feedback loop on CSAT and being able to do that. It doesn't mean you go out there and raise them 50%, right? Like you
Yeah.
need to
Yeah.
kind of think through, a strategy to execute that and try to, manage as much of the churn as possible. But I think, and again, I hate to use the word afraid, or we used the word terrified earlier.
Sure.
I don't know that those are the right words, but, it is a hesitation, right?
Yeah.
Because, things
Mm-hmm.
could go wrong. And I think, in order to grow, you've got to test those things out. And you may have a client that provides you some negative feedback. You talk it through and then you decide if that works. And, at that point, if that doesn't work, then you've got to look at your profitability, right? And say, okay,
Mm-hmm.
well, do I have too many engineers, right? Can I
Yeah.
service this differently in order to try to hit, where I need to hit? So,
Yeah.
there's multiple levers there, right? Not just that one, but I think that's one of the ones that if folks just implemented a good price increase strategy,
Mm.
I think, that's just instant revenue and profitability that they can drive up.
Yeah. No, it's a great point, because I know through lived experience, I was on both sides of that house. And then when I was running the revenue side, the growth side, like I had to run through and implement global price increase campaigns essentially at two different ones too. And I could tell you, I saw it from both sides of that fence too, like staring down the barrel of like, oh, are you sure? Like we're going to go out and ask these customers who are already getting like meh service to pay more for meh, even though like nothing else changed. And like to the extent that we ended up doing those campaigns, not that I'm advocating for like, go ahead and suck, but charge people more, like figure out how to not suck more first and then go charge more. But,
Absolutely.
but the
Yeah.
component of that was like, much like anything else, the fear only comes from the inaction and the anxiety over thinking about it rather than just going and doing it. And once you go and do it, you'll figure out all the details in between, and it'll never be another thing. And one of my mentors gave me was that it'll never be as good or as bad as you expect it to be. And that played out so true for the all 18 years that I was in
Yeah. It's
the
a great
industry.
balanced way to look at it. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So if we look back then at really connecting these three issues, right? So we've got no client feedback, we've got poor go-to-market strategy, and a revenue addiction, not so much profitability. Like, what do you think the uncomfortable truth is about the MSP industry that no one really wants to admit through that lens?
Oh, I think I'm going to pick up on something you just said. It's the lack of action, right? It's a
Mm,
lot. Each one of those take, leadership. Each one of them take thinking outside the box, or growing beyond
yeah.
maybe what you've done before. And
Mm-hmm.
each one requires you to take action, right?
Right.
And push it forward. So I think, that's something we often find too is, there's lots of, folks talking, we hear great things, feedback in the peer groups, right? Of
Mm,
things that we take action on. But if there is no accountability, if there is no execution plan for those,
yeah.
it doesn't matter, right?
Right.
You don't have everybody rowing in the same direction, and you've communicated why these things are important, and then implement them,
Mm-hmm.
and then have accountability related to it. It just then doesn't happen, right? So I think it's the inaction that
Yeah.
really, you know, is the secret, or the hidden secret. And again, I would say that's not necessarily in the MSP world. That's in all businesses, right? They're trying
Mm-hmm.
to, grow. If you truly want to grow, there has to be action. There has to be action every day, right? And improvement
Yeah.
every day.
Such a good, such a good answer. And it's so true. Like, default to action and commit to continuous improvement. I think that was one of the other things that took
Yeah.
me forever, like way too long to figure out. Like I wanted my own version of success was perfection, which was impossible. So like
Yeah.
because I couldn't go from 0 to 100, it wasn't worth going from 0 to 1. And not that it wasn't worth it, it was too difficult because I was making it too difficult, right? And so
Yeah.
kind of back to the point there is like just defaulting into 3, 2, 1, go and like
Yeah.
figure it out. It's the same thing you did when you decided to start the business. It's the same thing you did when you walked into your first prospect appointment. It's the same thing you did when you faced your first exchange migration. What do? We're people that
Yeah.
just like we say yes and we figure it out.
Yep.
So somewhere along the way, we got to bring that essence back into the business a bit more. And like if we're not uncomfortable, then we're not growing. And if we're not growing, we're not evolving. And if those things are true, then you're also probably not driving your business, to your other point, leadership. Um, I think the industry expects leadership to just like for people to come pre-equipped with that. That was another lesson I had to learn was like there's a huge difference between management and leadership. And oftentimes it seems MSPs, because they're reacting to the chaos of not having systems and structure and documentation and all that stuff, we overcompensate by providing an abundance of management, micromanagement even, but like a total absence of leadership. And those two things are not mutually inclusive or mutually exclusive. And really sitting with that and understanding like where can I do better today in providing my team clarity on what it is we're doing or where we're trying to go, and just taking one step today. And it might even be as simple as having a conversation with them, not an email and not a Teams message, right? But like donuts in the morning and a 10-minute meeting, or like a beer in the
Yeah.
afternoon and a 10-minute meeting, just actually talking to our people.
Yeah.
Uh, but leadership, I think you nailed it on the head too, with leadership and action.
Yeah, I wasn't planning on quoting this quote, so I won't have the name of the quote, but we can get it and put it
Yeah.
in the YouTube or whatever. But and I'll paraphrase the quote, but like it really rang true. It was in essence, if you're not embarrassed of where you were a year ago, you're not learning, right? You're not
Mhm.
developing. I don't know that I would necessarily use the word embarrassed, right? But
Yeah.
if I think it's just a true statement of if you look back a year ago, if you haven't improved yourself, right? And
Mhm.
look, we all certainly made lots of mistakes, right? And still
Yeah.
learning, and
Yeah.
leadership journey still young, right? And
Yeah.
still got some time here to go. And but yeah, I think that's just a great quote
Mhm.
to remind yourself to kind of think about where you were at the same time last year and keep going, right? And do
Yeah.
the 80-20 rule. You're right. Like you can't be a perfectionist.
Yeah.
Get it 80% there and go, right? And
Right.
then you'll figure out the other part by learning, right? Fail
Yep.
fast, right?
Yeah.
Pivot and go.
Yeah.
And again, I think that's where, again, as we go out and talk to different folks and, you know, it just kind of depends on where the MSP wants to go, right? If they want to
Mhm.
continue to grow, then they'll do that self evaluation and they'll get involved in the peer groups. So they'll talk to folks like us, right? And
Yeah.
we'll challenge them in certain areas on that, and we go grow together and enjoy the journey together, right? So
Yeah. Absolutely. That's a great way to wrap up the piece too. Of if people have enjoyed hearing from you today, Don, and they want some more Don, where is the best way for them to get in touch with you?
yeah, absolutely. So again, joined Knox Capital about 6 months ago. So certainly look me there up on the webpage. Get me on LinkedIn, and then I'm certainly joining a lot of different conferences. I think one of the things I was so lucky that I had great peers and
Mhm.
leaders and partners at the MSPs I was at. I didn't really participate a lot in some of the ConnectWise peer groups and some of those types of things. I didn't really even realize that whole community was out here, right?
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
that's certainly something now that I've had an exit out of an MSP and kind of pivoting now to the other side of the table with helping with investing, right, and investing more full time versus operating full time, getting
Yeah.
more involved in those types of things, getting an opportunity. Thank you again for participating in this, right?
Yeah.
So definitely find me on LinkedIn, find me on the Knox Capital, or come hunt me down at one of the conferences for sure.
Awesome. And then your opportunity now to ruin the next guest's day with something a little more challenging than pizza toppings, if you want. So, what would one question be that you could leave behind for the next guest?
Yeah, who's going to win the Super Bowl next year?
All right, we could throw that up there, and then someone will have to throw a pineapple pizza party though, or
Yeah, exactly,
create a
exactly.
war during halftime.
Yeah, I
Awesome.
say that because we got to see what's going to happen with the Chiefs, right?
Yeah.
So are they going to do a comeback here and win the Super Bowl next year? So yeah,
Yeah.
let's see what the next guest prediction is.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you again, Don. Appreciate it, and thank you to the audience for tuning in to this episode of MSP Insider.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it.